Hey guys, hope you're doing well. This is for APUS. This is the third video of the week. I hope you all watched the last two that I left. If you have not done that yet, then please do so right now before you actually watch this video. So this will be the third of three videos this week. I will not leave one on New Year's Eve, obviously, or New Year's Day. So the next one will be this coming Sunday. So remember, watch the two previous ones, this one, and then one on Sunday, and then we'll be caught up, and then we can start talking. When we go back to school, well, or at least virtually, we can start talking about the situation in Europe and how it led to the rise of Hitler and fascism and what the U.S. response to that was going to be. So we can start that we will start that on Monday. So make sure you watch all these videos because we're summing up the New Deal. Okay, so we left off yesterday talking about the court packing plan and the fact that it did a lot of damage to Roosevelt politically, even though, we talked about this, but or at least I talked about this in yesterday's video, that it was probably necessary for FDR to do something, right? Because the Supreme Court was about to hear arguments about whether Social Security and the Wagner Act were constitutional or not. So that's the heart of the New Deal. So if they had struck that down like they had been striking down other parts of the New Deal, then that would have just been, in many ways, a mortal blow. So FDR really felt like he had no other option but to propose the court packing plan. So even though it didn't work, it didn't pass. It did get that one Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts to begin voting to uphold the New Deal, switch in time that saved 9. And the fact that full pensions were actually reinstated for retired Supreme Court justices actually peeled off a lot of those old conservatives who had been lingering for a very long time. And ultimately, FDR got to make appointments to the Supreme Court, ultimately appointing every member of the Supreme Court by the end of his terms in office. Okay, but even though we made the case that it was, or at least I'm trying to make the case that it probably was necessary for FDR to do something, court packing did deal a really big blow to FDR's political prestige. Before court packing, he seemed to have the Midas touch. Everything he touched turned to gold, right? He could get anything passed. He could do no wrong. He had just been overwhelmingly reelected. But once court packing went down to defeat, it really was kind of like his opponent smelled blood, to use a shark metaphor. And the thing is that, once the king was weak, then a lot of people felt more emboldened to kind of take him on. And that happened in the last few years of the New Deal. So let's talk about that. Now, in 1937, which was really not a great year for FDR all around, I guess, a severe recession hit the United States. Now, the United States had never really gotten over the Depression, right? He came in with 25% unemployment, but unemployment had been going down to the point where by 1937, it was only 14%. So that is a really big achievement. But the thing is that FDR, in many ways, took the wrong lesson from that. He was saying that, well, I guess the worst of the Depression is over, so I can begin to cut government spending, particularly on public works programs. But the thing is that the reason why the economy was getting better was because of government spending. So if he cut government spending, the result of that would be that it will be what they call in economics a double dip, meaning the economy would wind up getting bad again, if he cut government spending so much. Also, FDR, to kind of explain why FDR kind of came around to this idea that, well, we have to start cutting government spending, is that he never was thrilled about the fact that he'd been running such deficits. Remember, a deficit is when the government is spending more than it's taking in. And, he never really felt completely comfortable with that. He did it because he felt there was no other option. But he was never really thrilled about having done it. So he kind of seized the opportunity to kind of go back to a balanced budget, or a budget closer to balance. So FDR cut New Deal spending quite significantly. They cut back on the WPA and the PWA, which remember were the main public works programs that Roosevelt had actually passed during his first term. Social Security taxes were beginning to be collected for the first time in 1937. Remember, that takes money out of people's paychecks in order to fund the Social Security system. Also, the Federal Reserve, which is out of Roosevelt's control, but the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, which made it a lot more expensive to borrow money. So the result of all these actions was that unemployment jumped back up to 19%. Which is a significant increase. Manufacturing declined by 37%. So this was a pretty serious situation where the economy is basically, unemployment had been going, from here when FDR was appointed, it had been going down, and then it shot back up as a result of his actions. FDR, his initial impulse was to blame business for the economic downturn, but eventually realized that a lot of the mistake was his, that he should not have cut government spending to the degree that he did. In 1937. So he fully embraced by this time Keynesian economics. Now, Keynesian economics is based on the principle that if the economy is, there are only three entities that can spend: business, consumers, and the government. And if there's an economic depression, consumers and businesses are not spending. Right? So that means that the only entity that's really left to spend is the government. So the government has to deliberately run deficits in order to pump money into the economy. And the government can do that because the government has pretty much an unlimited ability to borrow money by selling bonds. So if the government floods the economy with money, that will help stimulate the economy. So Roosevelt embraced that when he realized, the mistake that he had made by cutting government spending like he had in 1937. He massively increased government relief spending and unemployment began declining again. But it never reached the levels it was in 1937 until the United States began ramping up for the Second World War. World War II ultimately did end the Depression. And it wasn't the war itself that ended, something in the essence of war that ended the Depression. It was the fact that the government put so much money into the economy in order to pay for the war. Not pay for the war, in order to win the war, right? By building bombers and planes and tanks and uniforms and all the things that you need to do, that the government put so much money into the economy that is what gave everyone a job and ultimately got the economy out of depression. So it was the government spending that did it. Now, but I have to say that really is a mark of leadership, right? Sometimes some leaders, a policy of theirs isn't working, but they just keep doubling down on it. They just say, well, we just got to keep doing it and eventually it will work. But FDR realized that he did something, it wasn't working, and then he reversed course. That's very, very important for any political leader. It's very important for us in our lives, right? If something we're doing isn't working, we shouldn't keep doing it, right? We should try to change course. Now, FDR lost significant political support as a result of the court packing fight and as a result of that recession in 1937. And also, FDR became increasingly distracted by some of the ominous events in Europe as the 1930s were winding down. Things were looking really bad. The fascists had taken over Germany, Italy, Spain. Japan was very militaristic in Asia. So Roosevelt ultimately got distracted by a lot of these events. But he did not lose his desire, though, to extend the New Deal. Even though he was now focusing a lot on foreign affairs. In 1937, the FSA was passed, which actually provided low-interest loans to tenant farmers and sharecroppers in order for them to buy land, right? Because remember, they had been renting land before, or sharing their crop, which was even worse. But now they were getting loans to actually buy land on their own. It also provided services for migrant workers who have been coming to the United States to work the nation's farms. Also been coming from not just other countries, but from poorer parts of the country to largely California in order for work, like the Okies. So it provides services for them. The Housing Act was passed in 1937. It actually provided money for public housing and slum clearance. Now, slum clearance is where the government would pay to knock down, decrepit old apartment buildings and build better ones. Slum clearance, this was just the beginning of slum clearance, but it really took off in the late 40s and early 1950s, and it had a lot of unforeseen consequences. Like, for example, like a lot of the buildings that were being knocked down and the neighborhoods that were being, you know, bulldozed and reconstructed, whatever. They were poor, but they were real neighborhoods, right? Real people who had their lives there and wanted to stay there, or at least wanted to make their lives there, right? But by knocking down these buildings and putting everyone in housing projects, and also knocking down a lot of institutions in these communities that provide services and the like, that really, in many ways, devastated a lot of urban America. So it had good intentions. They tried to, like, let's make the poor areas better, but in the result of that was often destroying poor neighborhoods in order to reconstruct them in an image that the government thought was better and often wasn't, right? As we know, housing projects often have a lot of problems, right? And those were built as an improvement on the way that people had been living before. A lot of, I think we mentioned this before, but a lot of Roosevelt's housing policies got a lot of criticism because, especially after the fact, is for the fact that in many ways it enshrined redlining in American law. Remember where they used to draw lines around a map where they said these are the areas where white people live, these are the areas where black people live. So black people were not allowed to get loans to buy houses in areas that were majority white. So again, the New Deal, which did do a lot for African Americans, but it really didn't fight very aggressively against Jim Crow. And against the segregation policies that were already in place in the United States. So that is a failing of the New Deal. But remember, FDR really felt that he needed the support of Southern Democrats in order to pass the rest of his agenda, which is why he often, was not as aggressive on civil rights as he should have been. Now, I would say the most important piece of reform legislation that was actually passed in Roosevelt's second term was the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. Now, what this did was it was basically a sweeping piece of reform legislation, the last major piece of reform legislation of the New Deal era. It finally banned child labor. Remember, the government had been trying to do this for decades. This was a major goal of the progressives, right, back in the early 20th century. When the federal government finally did ban child labor in 1916, the Supreme Court overturned the ban a couple of years later, saying it was unconstitutional for the federal government to ban child labor, even though many states, in fact, most states had banned child labor, on their own without the federal government. So this was finally the nail in the coffin of child labor. It was finally banned on the federal level. The Fair Labor Standards Act also created the first minimum wage in the United States, which was 40 cents an hour. Which we once figured it out, like when we had class, which came to about $8 an hour, which is still not good, not good at all. But the thing is that it certainly was a lot better than having no minimum wage at all. It also authorized overtime pay to be given to workers. So if a worker works more than 8 hours a day, then they have to be paid time and a half. So just to make up these numbers, if someone makes $15 an hour, if they're made to work a ninth hour and 10th hours, they're supposed to make $22 an hour. They're supposed to make overtime, because you're only supposed to have to work 8 hours a day. Today, a lot of companies try to find, in fact, most companies find ways around, the overtime laws by actually, classifying somebody as a manager, an assistant manager, because the overtime laws don't apply to them. That's why when you go to the drugstore, there are so many assistant managers. You're like, this guy's like 19, how is he an assistant manager? Well, by classifying him as such, it's a way to avoid having to pay him overtime or her overtime. Also, there's an income threshold. If you make above a certain amount, you're not eligible for overtime. President Obama actually tried to change that in 2015 because that is within the executive's authority. But the Trump administration overturned that rule. Hopefully that is on the radar of the new Biden administration because people deserve overtime, right? If you're made to work more than 8 hours a day, you should be compensated for it. Now, FDR, so this is a really important thing. It also, interestingly, the Fair Labor Standards Act banned eyebrow dye. So you can't, I don't know how that got in there, but eyebrow dye actually is very dangerous because, if dye gets in your eye, that's not good. Especially the dye they probably had years ago, which was probably, extremely strong. So you wind up losing your vision if the dye gets in there. But I'm never exactly sure why that got included in the Fair Labor Standards Act. But FDR also continued efforts to help American farmers, providing loans to farmers. The federal government began warehousing surplus crops, which remember was an idea from the 1920s, the McNary-Hagen Act, which Coolidge had vetoed twice. So the whole idea of warehousing the surplus crops is when prices rose, farmers would sell their surplus crops and then be able to repay the loans that the federal government had given them. So it's a really, really important piece of legislation that really helped America's farmers. But FDR would have liked to go bolder and liked to deal with a lot more issues, but he was increasingly being blocked by a group called the Conservative Coalition in Congress. And on paper, it looked like Roosevelt had these massive Democratic majorities in Congress, which he did, but being a member of the Democratic Party back then didn't necessarily mean you were a liberal or a progressive or supported Roosevelt. Remember, all Southerners were Democrats because of the old Civil War loyalties, but they certainly were not progressive. Some were, but especially on economic issues, but the majority of them were not. They were conservatives. So this conservative coalition was made up of Republicans and conservative Democrats, and together they were blocking a lot of further New Deal legislation. So they began cutting welfare spending. They tried to cut taxes from the levels FDR had raised them to. They opposed or at least a lot of New Deal programs. And conservatives argued that this was just done because it was an emergency with the Depression. Even though a lot of them had opposed it even then. So we should move on from that and go back to balanced budgets and more limited government. And unfortunately for Roosevelt, they actually had a lot of success in blocking his agenda. So in the 1938 congressional elections, remember every 2 years there are elections for Congress. FDR, to borrow a phrase from Stalin, because he was doing this in the 1930s. I'm not comparing the two by any means, but Roosevelt tried to purge the Democratic Party of conservatives, those people who are trying to block his agenda, saying, look, this is supposed to be a progressive party, my party, and people within this party are the ones who are actually blocking me from actually passing a lot of New Deal legislation. So FDR made a deliberate effort to try to defeat Democratic opponents of the New Deal in Democratic primaries. Now, that is a really big deal because incumbent presidents almost always support incumbent members of their own party for re-election to Congress. So if you're a Democratic president, you almost always support Democratic senators and Democratic congressmen when they run for re-election. It's almost always expected that you do that. But Roosevelt made very public and sometimes embarrassing attempts to try to defeat conservative Democrats in the party primaries, urging Democratic voters to support more progressive candidates. And he suffered some serious setbacks. He endorsed 14 candidates, liberal candidates, against conservative Democratic incumbents. Of those 14, only one person actually won. So 13 of the 14 people he actually went out against wound up winning re-election anyway. So it shows that Roosevelt did not have complete control over the Democratic Party. Plus, the Republicans made big gains in the 1938 congressional election. So the fact that the conservative coalition got even bigger, and now the conservative Democrats are even angry at Roosevelt because he's trying to defeat them. So FDR's failure to control his own party also undermined a lot of confidence in his leadership, and there was this gradual feeling that emerged that the New Deal, or at least the heady days of the New Deal, were really coming to an end. That it was really going to be very difficult for Roosevelt to really go further and actually, be bolder and get New Deal legislation passed because of this conservative coalition. Plus, things in Europe were getting worse and worse, so most of Roosevelt's attentions began shifting to that. So that was pretty much the end of a lot of the New Deal fervor. Even though I want to spend a few minutes now just assessing the New Deal. Let's just analyze it. Was it effective? Did the New Deal really work? Now, conservatives were just appalled at the fact that government had expanded to the point that it had. A solid third of America hated Franklin Roosevelt. from the almost from the very beginning, and everything they stood for, right? Big government attempts to trying to make trying the government's trying to make all these efforts to try to give people jobs and the like, so regulate business. Conservatives don't agree with that ideologically, so they had a lot of problems with Franklin Roosevelt. They had this feeling that the whole American way of life was being undermined, right? The idea of rugged individualism and that you don't have to depend on others for help, right? People think that that's like the American spirit, but they felt that Roosevelt was really undermining that. There was too much spending. Government had gotten too intrusive. A lot of conservatives argued. But interestingly, despite these arguments, the majority, I would even say the vast majority, of New Deal programs were ultimately accepted by the American public, even people who are not Roosevelt supporters. Like, you didn't see many people advocating the repeal of Social Security, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the FDIC after it was passed, right? Some conservatives said, oh, we shouldn't go further, but not that many actually argued, oh, we should get rid of those programs. So once they were passed, the American public came to accept them. That's the thing about liberal reform. When liberals attempt or progressives attempt to make some major reform, there's usually a lot of opposition to it. But if it manages to get passed anyway, then people begin accepting it, and they don't want you taking it away from them. Which is the biggest reason why Obamacare, which was very unpopular when it was first passed, and for years after, when it was finally getting implemented, though, Obamacare actually got more popular, right? Because it's one thing when it's a theory, it's another thing when it's something I actually might need or someone in my family might need. And a New Deal consensus emerged during this time that basically said, yes, the government does have a role to play in making sure that people have a basic standard of living, making sure that the business is not abusing the public. And this consensus was accepted by both parties, except the most conservative Republicans. But most mainstream Republicans at this time, and for decades afterwards, accepted that premise that the government does have some role to play. So very few of them were advocating a return to like Coolidge, Hoover level of non-interference. That's changed though in the recent decades, right? Ronald Reagan, who was elected president in 1980, certainly did not support the New Deal consensus. But that meant there was like a sign. Republicans afterwards really didn't either. But there. That means it was like a solid 5 decades where both the 5 decades where both the 50 years almost where both the Democrats and Republicans accepted the idea that there has to be some government role in the economy. Now, the thing is that we're critics on both the left and the right. So we talk about critics on the right, the people who oppose FDR for conservative reasons. But a lot of leftists, I won't say a lot, but there were some leftists who also opposed the New Deal, mostly after the fact. Most liberals supported the New Deal overwhelmingly in the 1930s. But after the fact, there was some criticism of the New Deal, saying, well, it should have spent more money, right? And the fact that World War II ended the Great Depression, the fact the government spent so much money and it got the economy out of the depression. To a lot of leftists, or people on the left, that's proof that, see, government spending actually does the trick. So there should have been more government spending. There was criticism of some of the racially discriminatory aspects of the New Deal, particularly after the fact. That many people on the left said, why did it do so much to protect capitalism? Capitalism itself had so many problems that it didn't really deserve to be protected to the extent that Roosevelt did. Remember, Roosevelt saved the banks. So they said greater efforts could have been made. A lot of liberals, especially those on the real left, argued, but mostly after the fact. More government spending, propping up the system of capitalism, they said was not right. So there was criticism of the New Deal, even to this day, on both sides of the ideological spectrum. But there is a general consensus, to use the phrase again, there's a general consensus that the New Deal was effective. That it did do a lot, maybe not everything, but it did do a lot to actually help the economy out of the depression. It didn't cure the problem, but it did a much better job than a lot of critics would like to have you believe. Just to remember what the condition of this country was when FDR was first elected president, right? This country was on its knees, economically devastated. Some states had closed all their banks. Limits have been placed on withdrawals. The New York Stock Exchange had closed. There were really no jobs available. Unemployment was up to 25%. It was a horrible, horrible situation. So FDR did do a lot to deal with some of those terrible aspects of life in the 1930s. So it stopped the bleeding, right? But it also did a lot more than that. It reformed America in a profound way. Because remember, there's a first New Deal and a second New Deal, right? The first New Deal was focused on the two R's, relief and recovery, while the second New Deal was focused mainly on reform. And it did do a lot of things to reform a lot of inequities in American society. An enormous amount of things. It really made government more friendly to the forgotten man, in the words of Franklin Roosevelt. 65% of all unemployed people in the 1930s, including my great grandfather, I told you that he worked for the WPA, were employed by a New Deal agency. So if you were out of work, you actually had a really good chance of actually going to getting a job through a public works agency that Roosevelt had created. Just listen to this record of achievement of the New Deal. 1 billion trees were planted. That's with a B. Massive infrastructure projects here in New York, the Lincoln Tunnel, the Triborough Bridge, all those things I showed you on the map, right? Which I also, put as a link on Google Classroom, so you can check that out if you want. 2,500 hospitals were built by the New Deal, 45,000 schools, 13,000 parks, 7,800 bridges, 700,000 miles of road were built by the New Deal. This is an absolutely astonishing record of achievement. And a lot of times when people look at the unemployment statistics, and the fact unemployment was still high, just to give you some idea, 1933 was 25%, 1934, 22, 1935, 20, 1936, 17, 1937, 14, 1938, 19. Remember, that's when he cut government spending. 1939, 17. 1940, 14. 1941, 10. So the trajectory was definitely going in the right direction, except that year when he cut government spending. Also, modern employment statistics were not really compiled until about 1940. So what those unemployment numbers are sometimes misleading because it counts people who worked in public works jobs, like worked for the WPA or the PWA. It counts them as still being unemployed. Which is not accurate. So those unemployment numbers look bad, but actually they are inflated. So with the coming, I think, most economists would say, now with the coming of the World War II, New Deal fervor ebbed. It definitely did, but it didn't disappear. Right? Their liberal Democrats were so deeply inspired by Franklin Roosevelt and what he had done to actually get the economy out of depression, to try to make people feel better about things. He gave fireside chats where he went on the radio trying to pump up people's spirits, right? Trying to be optimistic, right? And trying to show that the government was on their side and was trying to do something to help them. That did an enormous amount of good to actually deal with a lot of the desperation that people were feeling as a result of the New Deal. So Franklin Roosevelt's domestic record was largely a huge success with some problems, of course, which we've discussed. But all in all, it was a great job by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. All right, guys, very good. So remember, watch these videos. Hopefully, if you're at the end, hopefully you've watched the entire thing. Watch it from start to finish. I'll leave another video for you guys to watch on Sunday. So it'll already be 2021 by then. And I'll leave you a video for you to watch on Sunday. So in the meantime, make sure you're caught up with all these videos, right? Hopefully this is, if you're listening to this should be the absolute last one you've watched, because I really want you guys to go in order. All right. Very good. So I will see you all on Sunday on virtually, and Happy New Year. Peace.